So, I just realized I'm using a very girly cup today, which is great because we're on video. So, turn with me to Hebrews 11, and we may read some of it. 1,000,000 years ago, we started a lesson about belief that versus belief in, and we started talking about true faith. And you may remember the analogy that I gave you was a police officer in a bulletproof vest with a gun drawn on him. That he can believe that the vest will work, but the minute that the trigger is pulled, all of a sudden he has to move past that faith into a belief in the bulletproof vest, because right now he's trusting it to save his life. Now, we talked about what is faith, and we came up with a really wordy Stevens translation for that. Faith is an assured expectation built on a firm foundation, believing the proof of things unseen. So we've never seen God, but we believe in his proof. He's proved himself to us, and that we expect him and we expect his good things, and it's solid, it's firm, and we are 100% fully convinced that we don't believe a lie. Now, then after that, we talked about where faith came from, and we talked about that we are dead. The Bible describes us in Ephesians as dead. So faith cannot be drummed up from us because we're dead. When you're dead, you can't do anything. We use this weird analogy that if you want a body to dance, you have to be the factor that picks it up and waltzes it. So God does just that. God is the God of resurrection. That's going to be next week. And what happens is that God gives the faith for you to believe. If you don't believe that, read Romans 12:3, where it literally says that God assigns different measures of faith to different people, much to my frustration, because during all this going on with us, Jonathan Brown came over to the house and he said, "Justin, sometimes I get so frustrated with you." And I said, "Well, why is that?" And he said, "Because in a situation like this," he's like, "I just feel like I would be questioning everything, and you, Mr. Predestination, are just sitting over here going, it's God's will, it's got a reason, God's doing this for something, God doesn't make mistakes." And he's like, "It's sickening. It's absolutely sickening." So it would be real nice if, for example, my kids had the faith of an 80-year-old man that's been through life. That would be amazing. But that's not the way God works. God doesn't make everybody in the same way, which honestly, I have a kid that acts just like me, and I couldn't handle it. I absolutely could not handle it. Me and Julia fight all the time. I don't know if y'all see it, but it happens. So then I want to talk today about, what does faith cost? What does it cost? Ultimately, in the modern day that we live in, you can be a Christian without it costing you anything. We look through Hebrews 11. I'm not going to go through all of it, but you see people like Abraham, where for him to believe God, it literally cost him his family, his home, his lands. He left. God had him leave, but God doesn't call all of us to that today. So here we have that living in the Bible Belt right here in North Georgia, you can say, "I'm a Christian," and honestly, according to where you're at, it could give you more benefits than it could detriments. It's a little bit different when you go to Chattanooga, but you can claim the name Christian and generally be accepted for it, because church culture is typically integrated into the lifestyle. I've talked about before, we're starting to move away from that, but as of right now, we're still on that tail end of it. So chances are that any kid that you talk to that's above the age of 10 has gone to a youth group at some point in their life. Now, some of the younger kids, maybe not, because remember that this paradigm is shifting. Every adult in this area has probably attended at least one church service of some denomination. Chances are they've went to appease a family member on Christmas, or they've put in their Easter service so they're good for a year. Generally, in America, just in generalities, everyone knows at least a little bit about Jesus. If you ask anybody, who is Jesus? The default answer is they'll say, oh, he died to save everybody from their sins. Well, what does that mean? And then they don't know. Then they can't define. Well, he makes it where if you're good, you can get there. Delicious. People will use, if you've been in church at any point in time, you'll know that people will use the church, that they like having a church in their community, even if they don't desire to go to it, because they'll use the church as poverty relief. They'll use it for a free meal. They'll use it as a social club, a professional network gathering, or honestly, in more rural places, they'll just use it for something to do. It's somewhere to go. It's a way to meet people. It's something to do. But the issue with that is that if you just casually drop that you're Christian in other parts of the world, it starts costing you very dearly. If you admit to being Christian in China, there's problems. Let's bring that to the Western world. We see in the UK, which we just had our missionary from Wales, which is to the southwest of England there in the UK, part of the UK, you can be jailed for a hate crime for street preaching. That's England. That's the UK. That's the Western world. That's part of us, right? Canada has been putting pastors in jail for opening churches during COVID. That's our continent. That's right here. So it's beginning to close. The vice is starting to close in slowly, very slowly. But as of right now, we can identify with a church and it's okay. Well, I say that, but for the first time in American history, people are actually starting to be honest about what they truly believe. I'm convinced that the human heart hasn't changed since the beginning of this book. That people are still the same as they were in Genesis internally. We may think because we have this higher standard of living, we may think because we have this cool technology that they didn't have. Abraham probably would have killed to have a tractor until he had to work on it. And then, but we think that we're so much better than those that came before us. But then you read the Psalms, then you read Lamentations, and you realize the human heart hasn't changed much. There's nothing new under the sun. People are the same that they've always been, and I'm here to say that people cared as little for the things of God in old school America as they do now. They just lied about it. Or maybe they went to a church, but it was for one of the reasons I said before, especially in a rural area. There's nothing else to do. Especially whenever you look at, if you ever look at alcoholism throughout history, America's been hitting whiskey pretty hard throughout history. It actually didn't chill out until the Prohibition. And then everybody got fat on Coke. Which here's a cool fact for you. This has nothing to do with anything, but the reason baseball became America's national pastime is directly because of the Prohibition. So what would happen is that whenever dads would get off work, they couldn't go to bars because those were illegal. And most people, contrary to what Hollywood wants you to believe, weren't so obsessed with alcohol that they would go to the speakeasies and stuff. Those were the hardcore people. Most people just, well, okay, it's the law. So they switched to root beer floats. But something happened. All of a sudden, they could take their kids to those places. They could take their kids to a bar and get ice cream and a Coca-Cola. So they would. They would take their sons, they would take their daughters with them to these places, and they would listen to baseball on the radio. And all of a sudden, you had a generation of kids that thought baseball was the greatest thing ever because it's the first sport that they ever got to hear live. And restaurants and bars were the only places that could afford to buy a radio in the 30s. So all of a sudden, baseball became real popular. That has nothing to do with any of this, but it's a cool factoid. But let's get back to talking about church attendance. 1937, 73% of Americans said that they attended church. Now, of course, I want to say this. That doesn't mean 73% of Americans did. That means 73% of Americans said they did. So anytime that you look at a poll, always know there's going to be a margin of error because it's what people are saying versus what they're doing. And if we've been alive for 15 minutes, we know what people say and what they do are very different things. That holds steady all the way through the year 2000. From 1937 to the year 2000, it hovers around 73%, give and take a few percentages. Whenever you get to the year 2000, it drops to about 70%, but that's still within a margin of error right there. Well, what happened in 2000? Well, we know that's when the internet started really blowing up. That's when technology really started becoming not slow. Well, you get to 2010, and 61% of people are saying they attend a church. Then you get to 2020, and 47% of people say that they attend a church. Now, what is sad, this is Gallup, by the way, Gallup polls here. What's really sad is that reading through these, Gallup does not accredit any of these numbers to COVID restrictions. That is to say, the best I could tell from reading the article is that if you were watching church online, that counted as attendance in this poll. 47%, less than half. I think that number is more accurate throughout the years. I think people are just beginning to be honest about it. What is sad is that COVID credits them, these numbers, to a rising number of people identifying as the religiously unaffiliated. They call them the religious nones, N-O-N-E-S. Now, and you'll hear that a lot. I get that a lot with my age group because I found that my age group, the early 30s in this area, tended to be the last age group that their parents made them go to church. Folks that are younger than me, folks in their 20s, their parents didn't make them. Kids that are even younger, their parents didn't make them because their parents didn't want to go. They didn't care about it, so they didn't make them do it. Now, in my age group, I've talked to a ton of people who their parents didn't go to church, but they made their kids go because it's the right thing to do, they would say. But they would. It doesn't make sense to me. I don't guess it has to. Quarantine has been an excuse not to go to church, but it's really not an excuse at all. It's just pulling back the curtains of men's hearts. My argument is not that quarantine killed church attendance. It's that people being honest about how they really feel killed church attendance. Because suddenly it's no longer taboo to not identify with a local church. The most common question that I remember in my elementary school is, where do you go to church? That's just what all the kids asked each other. Where do you go to church? And of course, this was before cell phones. Now, I don't know what the question is. Do you have an iPhone? Do you have X app? I don't know. But it was, where do you go to church? Where do you go to church? And we were all like, it was kind of like, my dad could beat up your dad, but it's like, my church is better than your church. No way, man. We had blow up floats. Oh, yeah? Well, we had root beer floats. Oh, man, I should go to your church. But all of a sudden, it's no longer taboo to say, well, I don't go to church. If you were the kid that said, well, I don't go to church, we started fighting over, well, you need to come with me. No, you need to come with me. You need to come with me. That's not a thing anymore because it's not taboo. The norm is, yeah, man, that's good for you, but that's just not for me. Well, I wish it would be. But suddenly, you don't have to rely on the church for your relationships, because as we're seeing with all these churches around us shutting down, the church is not the center of the community anymore. It was neat when we would go on these cruises. I never wanted to cruise ever in my life. I'm not I'm not a boat guy, man. I'm not a pirate. I don't have any reason to be on the seas. And then the Leviathan might still be living under there, man. And I don't want to be the guy to wake him up. And so, but faith has dragged me on a couple of them, kicking and screaming until I get to the buffet. And so, but what's so cool is you'll dock on one of these old island cities in the Bahamas, and you can look from the top deck of the ship out at the city, and the largest building is going to be, or at least the tallest, is going to be a church. Some sort of chapel, some sort of church house where they could meet. And that's because whenever Europeans would get there, they realized the need for spiritual worship, that the soul of a man actually has more importance than the body. And they would build it, they would put these huge steeples on them so that no matter where you were in the community, you could always locate the church, because it was the center of the community. You knew whenever you had trouble, you could go to the church. You knew whenever you had pain, you could go to the church. You knew that whenever it was time to worship, you could find it just by looking up. That'll preach. You could probably make something of that. But all of a sudden, you don't have to rely on that anymore, because you have the internet that's able to connect you without having to go to a place to meet people. You can network without really having to put in the work. Part of this blame is on the individual who's not truly converted. I'm sure we all know of folks in the church that have used the church just for its networking capabilities and not because they were truly converted. But also part of the blame is on the local church itself, which keeps dividing the body and creating 30 churches within a 2-mile span. That doesn't show unity. When you have one church in 5 miles, that church is working hard to serve its community. When you have 60 crammed in there, it kind of cheapens it a little bit. But anyway, here we go. My question is, what does faith cost? Hebrews 11, I'm not going to read it all for the sake of time, but it lists a hall of fame of people who in the past were great individuals of faith. And what's interesting about this list is that their faith was not always rewarded how you would think it is. You would think that somebody would have great faith, so God would shower them with these huge blessings, which we tend to think in material rewards. It doesn't always work that way. We saw earlier through this lesson 1,000,000 years ago that we've already forgot about, that God provides the faith, even to these guys. God provided the faith. So we really have nothing to boast in except Christ and Him crucified. We can't say, hey, I drummed up more faith than Mark. Man, I'm way better than Mark. Can't do that because we have nothing to boast in of ourselves, because it's all God provided. So the only thing we can boast in is Christ and Him crucified. And honestly, we all came the same way, so I can't be better than Mark. All I can say is I repented like Mark did. God supplied them faith even when things did not go exactly their way, and sometimes their faith even cost them their lives. What does it cost? Let's look at examples from the Hebrews Hall of Faith. I'm not going to give verses. I'm just going to kind of say a few things here. Abel offered a better sacrifice by faith. What was his reward? He was murdered. His faith cost him his life. Noah listened to God's warning. What did it cost him? Sure, his life was saved, but he was stuck in a boat for 150 days. And that's a cruise. Abraham went out seeking a city. What was his reward? He never saw that city on earth. Sarah was considered faithful. She was rewarded with a son. Finally, something positive. I ain't going to just say negative all the time. Sarah was considered faithful and was rewarded with a son. Now let's get negative again. Moses' parents, they hid Moses, and they lost their son to Pharaoh's house. Ultimately, His mom got to nurse him as a child, but whenever he became of age, he had to go to Pharaoh's house. Moses had the faith to identify with the Israelites. What happened to him? He ended up having to flee Egypt. He identified with the wrong people and murdered the wrong guy. The Israelites crossed the Red Sea. God drowned their enemies. So you're seeing two sides of faith here. On some of them, it has expensive costs. And on the other side, it has amazing rewards. But the thing that's steady is that everyone is held to the same faith. My personal favorite in Hebrews 11 is Rahab. She believed God, and she gets included in the bloodline of Christ. That's super cool because we never get to see Rahab as an experienced God-fearer. All that we get to see is Rahab say, I believe, and then start lying. I feel like we can identify with her. Yeah, I'm a Christian, and then we just ruin it. That might preach too. Hebrews 11:32 through 38. What more shall I say? For time will fail me if I tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, and the prophets, who by faith conquered kingdoms, performed acts of righteousness, obtained promises, shut the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, from weakness were made strong, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. Women received back their dead by resurrection, and others were tortured, not accepting their release so that they might obtain a better resurrection, and others experienced mockings and scourgings, yes, also chains and imprisonments. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, they were tempted, they were put to death by the sword, they went about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, ill-treated, men of whom the world was not worthy, wandering in deserts and mountains and caves and holes in the ground. They were sawn in two, and the Bible, it doesn't let you have a magician put you back together. So sometimes we see their faith was rewarded by great success, but sometimes it merited death and pain. This is a big deal. Why? Because God awards the measure of faith to each as they need it. Faith has times of great reward, but faith also has times of great cost. So the question is, do the rewards outweigh the costs? So I want to look at a certain young man and see what his opinions are. Mark 10:17 through 27. I'm not going to read it all for you. You all know the story. This rich young man comes and he wants to follow Jesus, but the cost is just a little too high. He believes that Jesus has the way to eternal life. So we know the story. This man comes to Jesus and he says, what must I do to be saved? And Jesus says, you know what Moses said, keep the law. I'm giving you the abridged version. And the man says, I've done that from my youth. I've done that. And Jesus says, okay, well then go sell everything you have and then come and follow me. And the man leaves sad because he's rich. The Bible never says he comes to follow Jesus, because he doesn't. So he believes that Jesus is the way to eternal life, but he believes in his wealth. Belief that versus belief in. He believes that Jesus can do what he says he's going to do, but at the end of the day, his heart's in his money, because his money's been proven to be able to buy him a comfortable life. He believes Jesus, but his faith is in his money. You see, demons believe in Jesus. They've seen him. He's preached to them. But they don't believe in Jesus. So there's a big difference here. You see, this rich young ruler, his money has proven itself to him, and Jesus asked him to give it to the poor. This guy has not gone without. And Jesus asks him to go without. This guy has friends and family. When you're rich, you can have a lot of friends, man. The Gatsby effect. But Jesus says, leave that. Come follow me. This guy has ambitions. Anybody with money has ambitions. And Jesus says, abandon those. To this rich young ruler, the cost was too high. Listen, y'all know just as much as I do, to devote your life to Christ costs you everything. The price is high. I have seen men who have lost their entire families because they wanted to devote their life to Christ. And that's here. That's in North Georgia. That's in the Bible Belt. Jesus explains to him. See, the best thing about tea is that as it gets colder, it just gets better. At this point, coffee, I'd be spitting that out. I'd have to send Terry to the microwave with it. Jesus explains to the disciples after this guy leaves that it's easier to squeeze a camel through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to be saved. I remember being forced to take a home economics class in school, and one of the things they taught us was how to sew fabric together. And me, being as blind as I am, trying to thread that needle was so frustrating. But if the final had been to put a camel through there, man, I'm going to fail that class. And of course, the disciples, they know that Jesus is what he's talking about. And they're like, well, who can be saved? Because obviously, you can't put a camel through the eye of a needle. Most of us probably couldn't even ride a camel. If one of us owned a camel, it would be kind of cool. Buy Stacy a camel for her birthday. But the thing is he says it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle, which we know is impossible, because the rich don't need faith. Now listen, I've met people with money, and let me tell you how I define rich. This is how I define rich. If you unexpectedly lose your job and you're not worried about it 6 months later, chances are you're rich. If you lose your job and start panicking, you're not rich. I'll just tell you, that's how it works. You can have $10,000 in the bank and think you are rich. I promise you, that stuff goes fast. That stuff goes, lose your job for 6 months, that stuff's gone. But the thing is that people that are really, truly wealthy, they have their assurance in their riches. And that's because no problem can approach them that can't be solved by money. So the disciples get confused. Well, it's impossible to put the camel through the eye of a needle, so that means anybody with money can't be saved, right? Wrong. Jesus says, with man it's impossible, but with God it's possible. If God wants to put a camel through the eye of a needle, he can do it. And he can even make that camel be all right on the other end. If we try to use a hydraulic press and force a camel through the eye of a needle, we're going to be eating camel burgers because we're going to have ground camel. God can pass it through no problem. Anyone can be saved. I've met people with money that are some of the most generous people, and they use their wealth to further God's purpose. But I've met a lot more. I'm in the banking industry. I've met a lot more that trust in that wealth. And you want to know how you could tell a wealthy Christian versus a non-wealthy Christian? It's what their kids do when they die. Someone that has raised their family on Christian values and really fought to see their kids saved when they die, their kids don't fight. Their kids miss them. Those that trusted in their money, all of a sudden their kids have to go at each other's throats because what they have their faith in, they've got to get their hands on. So if faith is so costly, why should I desire to be saved? If the cost is so high, why should I desire it? Well, let me give you a few benefits. Eternal life. Ultimately, you're going to live forever. And I hate to tell you too, it's a source of comfort for us. I don't think it's going to be so comforting for the unbeliever. One day you get your body back. We're going to talk about that next week. You get to live eternally in a body. And that body's going to be in one of two places. In the New Jerusalem or in the eternal lake of fire. And I don't know about y'all, I've touched a hot stove before. Cooking corned beef hash. It was worth it. My favorite meal, by the way. Favorite meal. It looks and smells like dog food, but it tastes like heaven. And, yeah. According to faith, you got to have COVID to be able to eat that stuff because you just cannot smell it. But the fact is that you felt the pain of fire on your body. I don't want to feel that for an eternity. That's terrible. I don't wish that on anyone. That's why we want people to be saved. You're going to live forever. Favor with God is a good desire to be saved, to keep the faith. Because honestly, God is very big and God is very strong. I would rather be in His favor than in His ill favor. I preferred to be on my parents' good side growing up than on their bad side. Because their bad side tended to hurt my backside. I like being in favor. Peace of God. Not just peace with God, but peace of God. When something happens, like your mother unexpectedly dying, you can lay your head on the pillow at night and say, it's going to be okay, and believe it. You're not just lying to yourself. You get this cool thing called fellowship with believers. I think of friends that I've had throughout my life and friends that are unbelievers in our adulthood. And I see ways that they talk about each other, or they stab each other in the back, or the ways that they treat each other. And it's, why in the world would you want that to be your only set of friends? But then you can come and you can meet with people that are saved like you and actually have true fellowship with real people. Not only that, you get an avoidance of hell. You don't have to burn. It's quite nice. I like that. We all like the air conditioning. No reason to get too hot. Georgia's hot enough. You get a place to live in heaven. Maybe one day, if I can ever find it, I went through and broke down the word mansion in the King James Bible and really dug in deep about what our place in heaven is going to be like. Maybe we'll get to do that. But the biggest thing is that we get an abode by God. And then, later on, He shoots it down to a new earth. That's cool. We get victory over guilt. This is huge. Huge. People don't understand how much they live with guilt. I like the way that R.C. Sproul put it. Somebody said, I feel guilty. And he said, well, do you think maybe the reason you feel guilty is because you are guilty? And it just blew their mind. I am guilty. But you can have victory over guilt. You can live innocently. You can have victory over loneliness. We've all suffered with loneliness. And you can go through life knowing I never have to be alone. You get a purpose for your life. If we're just dust that becomes nothing, then life has no meaning. But through salvation, our life has meaning. No fear. Man, that's huge. That's huge. Reading through the Fox's book of martyrs and seeing men and women throughout history that have faced death unafraid. No fear. We become more than conquerors. Honestly, we become better people. I mean, that's just the way it is. Whenever you're a Christian, you don't ever see anybody brag about it. By the way, if you have to call yourself humble, you're not, man. If you have to call yourself the king, you're not the king. Tywin Lannister. But if you become a better person, and people notice it, In fact, it's one of the qualifications to be an elder. You have to be held in good standing in your community, and you have peace with God. What's the chief benefit of being saved? Will be done. You befriend the only one that can deliver you from your transgressions, and not only get to spend this life with him, but the life to come. You get an eternal relationship. Faith will cost you everything, but the rewards are out of this world.